Welcome to Eastern Brush, Western Seoul. Our channel is run by a group of friends passionate about traditional Chinese ink paintings and ancient texts. Through these freely accessible videos, we aim to share the wonders of ancient Eastern civilization with everyone. So far, we have translated and explained 16 volumes from the publicly available illustrated strange tales from a Chinese studio, Liaoshai Quantu. This rare collection originally consisted of approximately 90 volumes scattered across the world, with only 18 volumes publicly available. Including today's episode, we have just one more left to complete our coverage of the available texts. This means our journey through Liaoshai Quantu is nearing its end. The Liaoshai Quantu books were bound in an accordion-style format, with wooden panels on both ends, measuring 25 centimeters in length and 20 centimeters in width. The covers are wrapped in song brocade, bordered by wooden strips about 0.9 centimeters wide, each carved with 2 grooves for added detail. Today we continue with one of the 17 volumes housed in the Austrian National Library, volume 65, featuring the following tales: Yanluo, King of Hell, Cold Moon and Lotus, Lord Yangwu, The Drunken Madman, Martial Arts, The Starling, The Three Merchants, The Western Monk, The Mud Ghost, Farewell in a Dream, Immortal Su, and The Solitary Taoist. We will go through these stories one by one. A special thanks to our team member, Little Fish, for once again dedicating tremendous effort to organizing, translating, and sharing this content with us. Now, let's begin today's journey into the world of Liaoshai Quantu. Yanluo, King of Hell. In Laiwu, Shandong, there was a scholar named Li Zhongxi. He was known for his upright and honest character, never bending the rules for personal favors. However, every few days, he would suddenly die, his body becoming as stiff as a corpse, only to revive 3 or 4 days later. When people asked him what he had seen during these episodes, he kept it a secret and refused to say a word. There was another man in the same town named Zhang Sheng, who also experienced these periodic deaths. Unlike Li Zhongji, Zhang Sheng openly shared what he saw. He told people Li Zhongji is actually Yanluo, the King of Hell. When I arrive in the underworld, I serve as one of his officials. Zhang Sheng could even describe in detail the grand gates of the Yanluo Palace and the couplets inscribed on the main hall. One day, someone asked him, what was Li Zhongji doing in the underworld yesterday? Zhang Sheng replied, I can't reveal all the details, but I do know that he interrogated Cao Cao and even whipped him 20 times. The renowned writer Pu Songling reflected on this story and mused, Cao Cao's case must have been handled by dozens of different kings of hell by now. Surely, he has already been sentenced to reincarnate as a beast or to crawl barefoot up Blade Mountain as punishment for his crimes. His guilt is undeniable, and determining his punishment shouldn't be difficult. But after thousands of years, no final verdict has been reached. Why? Could it be that those sentenced to death prefer a swift execution to avoid prolonged suffering? And so the underworld deliberately delays Cao Cao's sentencing, forcing him to endure endless torment, never allowing him the relief of death. Cold Moon and Lotus. In the city of Jinan, there was a mysterious Taoist priest. No one knew his name or background. Regardless of the season, he always wore a thin cotton robe, fastened at the waist with a yellow sash, and nothing else. He used a half-broken comb to tidy his hair, twisting it into a top knot and securing it with the comb, making it look as if he wore a hat. Every day, he wandered barefoot through the market, and at night, he slept on the streets. Strangely, wherever he lay, the ice and snow within a few feet of him would melt completely. The Taoist's power revealed. When the Taoist first arrived in Jinan, he often performed magic tricks, and people eagerly offered him food. One day, a local scoundrel, hoping to learn the Taoist's skills, brought him some wine. But when the Taoist refused to teach him, the man grew resentful. One day, the rogue spotted the Taoist bathing in the river and saw an opportunity for revenge. He snatched the Taoist's robe and held it hostage, demanding to learn his magic. The Taoist clasped his hands and bowed, saying, Please return my clothes, and I will not withhold my little tricks from you. But the scoundrel, fearing deceit, refused to let go of the robe. The Taoist asked again, Are you truly unwilling to return it? The man sneered. Not a chance. The Taoist fell silent. Moments later, the yellow sash suddenly transformed into a massive serpent, thick as a man's arm, coiling around the rogue 6 or 7 times. It raised its head, flicked out its crimson tongue, and glared at him with furious, glowing eyes. Terrified, the rogue collapsed to his knees, his face turning pale as he gasped for breath, pleading for mercy. The Taoist calmly reached out and seized the yellow sash. It was no longer a snake. Meanwhile, a real serpent slithered away toward the city. From that day on, the Taoist fame spread even further. The Enchanted Banquet on Daming Lake. As news of his powers spread, high-ranking officials and wealthy families began inviting the Taoist to their homes. Even provincial governors and administrators sought his presence at their banquets. One day, the Taoist announced that he would host a grand feast on the pavilion above Daming Lake, inviting the most distinguished officials. When the day arrived, each guest found an invitation on their table, yet no one knew how the invitations had been delivered. When the guests arrived at the pavilion, the Taoist respectfully greeted them, but as they stepped inside, they found nothing. No tables, no chairs, only an empty hall. Suspicion arose that the Taoist had deceived them. The Taoist turned to a few officials and said, "I have no servants. May I borrow your attendants to help?" The officials agreed. The Taoist walked to a blank wall and drew 2 doors with his fingers. Then he knocked. From within, a voice answered. Then came the sound of locks turning, and with a creak, the doors swung open. Inside, the guests saw shadowy figures bustling about. Lavish furniture, screens, and ornate decorations filled the space. Servants within the room passed out these luxurious items, while the officials' attendants carried them into the pavilion and arranged them as instructed. The Taoist warned them, "Do not speak with those inside, just take what they hand you." As they worked, the 2 groups simply exchanged glances and smiles. Before long, the pavilion was transformed into a grand banquet hall, and dishes of fragrant delicacies and fine wines emerged from the mysterious doorway. The guests were awestruck. The illusion of lotus flowers. Daming Lake was known for its vast fields of blooming lotus flowers, but this banquet took place in the depths of winter. Outside the pavilion's windows, the lake stretched in endless, icy waves. A guest sighed, "Such a grand feast, if only we had lotus flowers to complete the scene." Everyone agreed. Just then, a servant in blue rushed inside and exclaimed, "The pond is covered in lotus leaves." The guests hurried to the windows and were astonished. Lush green lotus leaves now blanketed the lake, with countless buds nestled among them. In the blink of an eye, the buds burst open into a sea of brilliant, fragrant blossoms. A cold wind swept across the water, carrying the scent of lotus through the air. A servant was sent out on a boat to pluck some lotus seeds. But as he rowed toward the flowers, they always remained just out of reach. He rowed across the entire lake, yet the lotus flowers continuously retreated beyond his grasp. Finally, he returned empty-handed. The officials asked, "Why didn't you pick any?" The servant bowed and replied, "No matter how far I rowed, the flowers always kept their distance. When I reached the north shore, the blossoms had moved far to the south." The Taoist chuckled and said, "These are nothing more than illusions, flowers in a dream." As the banquet ended, the lotus flowers began to wither. A sudden gust of wind swept across the lake, knocking the wilted petals into the water. In an instant, they were gone, as if they had never existed. The Taoist's final trick. Among the guests was an official from Jidong who was captivated by the Taoist's magic. He invited him to the government offices where they indulged in daily revelry. This official had a treasured family wine, so precious that he never served more than 1 du at any gathering. But on one occasion, after the guests had finished their allotment, they begged for more. The official refused. "The wine is running out," he insisted. The Taoist laughed and said, "If you truly wish to drink to your heart's content, just ask me." The guests eagerly accepted. The Taoist took the empty wine jug, slipped it into his sleeve, and after a moment, pulled it out, completely full. To everyone's surprise, the wine tasted exactly the same as the official's rare vintage. The guests drank their fill, but when they had left, the official, feeling uneasy, rushed to check his wine storage. He found the seal on the jar still intact, but when he lifted it, the jar was empty. Overcome with embarrassment and anger, he accused the Taoist of sorcery, ordering his men to beat him with wooden staves. He watched as the first blow landed, only to feel a searing pain in his own backside. Startled, he ordered another strike. This time, the pain was unbearable, as if his flesh were being torn apart. The Taoist, groaning theatrically below the steps, appeared to suffer, but in reality, it was the official whose seat was soaked with blood. Frightened and humiliated, the official stopped the punishment and banished the Taoist from Jinan. After that, no one knew where he went. Some years later, he was spotted in Jinling, modern-day Nanjing, dressed exactly as he had been in Jinan. When questioned, he simply smiled and remained silent. Lord Yangwu. Lord Yangwu, Shuilu, was a native of Shuijia Island in Jiaodong. His father, Shui Gong, was a poor man who worked as a cattle herder for a local noble family. Near this family's estate was a barren piece of land where Shui Gong often brought his cattle to graze. He frequently observed snakes and rabbits battling in the grass, which he took as a sign that the land had exceptional feng shui. Believing it to be an auspicious burial site, he requested it from the landowner and built a small thatched hut to live in. Years later, Shui Gong's wife was about to give birth when a sudden downpour struck. At that time, 2 military commanders were inspecting the sea routes and happened to seek shelter in Shui Gong's hut. They noticed that flocks of crows and magpies were gathering on the roof, using their wings to shield the leaking areas from rain. This sight struck them as highly unusual. A short while later, Shui Gong emerged from the inner room. The commanders asked, "What were you just doing?" Shui Gong replied that his wife had just given birth. "What kind of child was born?" they inquired. "A boy," Shui Gong answered. The commanders were astonished and remarked, "This child is destined for greatness. Otherwise, why would the 2 of us high-ranking officials be here as his guardians?" They left in admiration. As Shui Lu grew up, he appeared rather dull and often had a runny nose. He was not regarded as intelligent. The Shui family, being of military lineage, was required to send a member for garrison duty in Liaoyang. That year, it was Shui Gong's family's turn, and his eldest son was deeply troubled over who would go. At that time, Shui Lu was 18, but due to his perceived foolishness, no one had arranged a marriage for him. Unexpectedly, he told his brother, "Brother, you seem worried. Is it because no one is willing to go serve in the army?" His brother sighed, "Yes." Shui Lu then grinned and said, "If you promise to give me the maidservant as my wife, I will go." His brother was overjoyed and immediately agreed. Shui Lu set off for Liaoyang with his new wife. After traveling a few dozen miles, a torrential rain began to pour. The couple sought shelter beneath a towering cliff. As soon as the rain ceased and they stepped back onto the road, the cliff behind them suddenly collapsed. Nearby villagers witnessed an astonishing sight, 2 tigers leaping out from beneath the cliff, circling Shui Lu and his wife before vanishing. From that moment on, Shui Lu transformed. He became incredibly strong and exuded an extraordinary presence. Through his fearless valor in battle, he achieved great military success and was granted the hereditary title of Lord Yangwu by the imperial court. During the Tianqi and Chongzhen reigns of the Qing Dynasty, a descendant of Shui Lu, who had inherited the Lord Yangwu title, passed away without a son, leaving behind only a posthumous child. In such cases, a temporary successor from a collateral branch of the family would assume the title until the direct heir was confirmed. At that time, it was required by law that if the wife or concubine of a hereditary noble was pregnant, she had to report it to the imperial court. The government would then assign an elderly woman to monitor her until the child was born. A year later, the widow gave birth to a daughter. However, even after childbirth, she still felt movement in her abdomen. 15 years passed, and several different attendants took turns watching over her. Then she unexpectedly gave birth to a son. According to the rules, the legitimate heir should have been granted the noble title, but the collateral family members protested, claiming the boy was not of Shui lineage. The government detained the attendants and subjected them to various interrogations. In the end, all of them testified that the child was indeed the true descendant of Shui Lu. Only then was he officially granted the title of Lord Yangwu. The Drunken Madman. Miao Yongding was a tribute student from Jiangxi. He had a habit of excessive drinking, to the point where his relatives and friends avoided him out of fear. One day, Miao visited his clan uncle's home. Because of his humorous and playful nature, the guests at his uncle's house engaged him in conversation and found him quite entertaining. As the gathering became lively, they all began drinking together. However, once Miao became intoxicated, his drunken nature took over. He began insulting those at the table, offending the guests. The situation quickly escalated into chaos. His uncle tried to mediate, but Miao, feeling that his uncle was taking the guest's side, turned his anger on him instead. With no other choice, the uncle hurried to inform Miao's family. When his family arrived, they carried Miao home and laid him on his bed. To their shock, his body had gone cold. Checking him closely, they discovered he had stopped breathing. He was dead. After his death, Miao found himself being dragged away by a man wearing a black hat. Soon they arrived at a government office with roofs of pale green glazed tiles, an architectural grandeur unlike anything seen in the mortal world. Standing before a high platform, Miao realized he was waiting to be judged. He thought to himself, "I haven't committed any serious crimes. This must be about that drunken brawl," reported by the guests. He stole a glance at the black-hatted man, who glared back at him with wide, bull-like eyes. Miao dared not ask questions. However, he reassured himself. After all, I am a tribute student. A mere drunken argument shouldn't warrant a severe punishment. Suddenly, an official in the main hall announced that all legal cases would be heard the following day. The gathered souls scattered like birds and beasts. Miao, having nowhere to go, shrank under the eaves of a nearby shop. The black-hatted man scowled at him and said, "You drunken scoundrel, night is falling. Everyone else has gone to find food and lodging. Where will you go?" Trembling, Miao replied, "I still don't understand what's happening. I haven't informed my family and I have no money with me. How could I possibly find a place to stay?" The black-hatted man scoffed. "Ha! You always have money when it comes to buying wine for yourself. If you keep talking nonsense, I'll smash your drunken bones to pieces with my fists." Miao hung his head, not daring to say another word. Just then, a man emerged from a nearby doorway. Seeing Miao, he gasped in surprise. "What are you doing here?" Miao looked up and, to his astonishment, recognized his maternal uncle, Jia, who had died several years earlier. At that moment, Miao finally realized, "I really am dead." Overcome with grief and fear, he cried out, "Uncle, save me!" Jia turned to the black-hatted man and said, "Eastern Spirit Messenger, this is family. Please come inside so we can talk." The three of them entered the house. Jia greeted the messenger with deep bows and implored him to take care of Miao. Before long, a feast was prepared and they sat down to drink. Jia then asked, "What happened to my nephew? Why did you come to take his soul?" The black-hatted man replied, "The king of the underworld was on his way to meet the Supreme Lord Laozi when he encountered your nephew in a drunken rage, shouting profanities. He ordered me to bring him in." Jia asked, "Has he already faced judgment?" "Not yet," the messenger replied. "The Supreme Lord Laozi happened to be dealing with a case involving beggars, so the king of the underworld hasn't returned yet." Jia pressed on. "What punishment awaits my nephew?" The messenger hesitated. "It's hard to say, but I do know that the king of the underworld has no patience for people like him." Hearing this, Miao broke into a cold sweat, his hands shaking so much that he could barely lift his cup or chopsticks. After a while, the black-hatted man rose and said, "I'm drunk from this fine feast. I'll leave your nephew in your care for now. Once the king of the underworld returns, I'll come back." With that, he departed. Jia turned to Miao and sighed, "You are an only son, and your parents cherished you like a jewel in their palm. They never had the heart to scold you. But ever since you were 16 or 17, after just 3 drinks, you would start picking fights, cursing and smashing doors if things didn't go your way. Back then, people excused it as youthful foolishness. But now, after all these years, you haven't changed one bit. What will you do now?" Miao fell to the ground, weeping bitterly. "It's too late for regrets." Jia helped him up and said, "I run a tavern here and have some influence. I will do everything in my power to help you. That black-hatted man is an envoy of Eastern Spirit. I often treat him to drinks, and we have a good relationship. The king of the underworld has countless matters to attend to every day. He might not even remember you. I'll speak to the envoy and see if he can release you on account of our friendship. He might agree." After pondering for a moment, Jia added, "But this is a heavy favor. It won't be possible without 10,000. Miao, overwhelmed with gratitude, swore he would find a way to pay the price. Jia agreed, and Miao stayed at his uncle's house. The next morning, the black-hatted man arrived early to check on him. Jia took him aside for a private discussion. After a while, Jia returned and told Miao, "It's settled. The envoy will come back later. I've used all my money to secure the deal. The rest of the sum you'll need to pay after you return to the living world." Overjoyed, Miao asked, "How much in total?" 10,000. Miao groaned. "Where would I find that much money?" Jia chuckled. "You only need 100 strings of paper coins and gold." Relieved, Miao exclaimed, "That's easy enough." As noon approached, the black-hatted man had yet to return. Miao Yongding decided to take a short stroll through the bustling marketplace. His uncle Jia warned him not to wander too far, and Miao agreed before stepping out. The marketplace was lively, with merchants trading just like in the world of the living. As he wandered, he came across a high-walled compound bristling with thorns, resembling a prison. Opposite it stood a tavern with a steady flow of patrons coming and going. A long, black-watered stream lay outside, its depths unfathomable, swirling ominously. As Miao paused to observe, a voice called from within the tavern, "Miao, what brings you here?" Startled, he looked up and recognized the speaker. It was his old literary friend, Wang, from a neighboring village whom he hadn't seen in a decade. Overjoyed, Wang stepped outside, greeted Miao warmly, and invited him in for a drink. As they reminisced over cups of wine, Miao, delighted by the prospect of returning to life and encountering an old friend, drank without restraint. Soon, his drunken nature took hold. He began nitpicking and criticizing Wang's words and behavior. Wang frowned. "It's been years, yet you haven't changed at all." Miao had always despised being called out for his drunken flaws. Enraged by Wang's remark, he slammed the table and cursed him. Wang, unimpressed, gave him a sidelong glance before standing up and leaving in frustration. Furious, Miao chased after him to the stream's edge and grabbed at Wang's hat. "You're impossible!" Wang snapped. With a shove, he sent Miao plunging into the black water. The stream wasn't deep, but it was filled with razor-sharp blades, as dense as thickets of reeds. They pierced through Miao's ribs and calves, pinning him in place with excruciating pain that shot through his bones. The filth and stench of the black water choked his throat, making him retch. On the shore, a crowd gathered, laughing at his plight. None showed any intention of helping. Just as despair gripped him, his uncle Jia suddenly appeared. Shocked to see Miao in such a state, he pulled him from the water and dragged him home. "You're beyond saving," Jia scolded. "Even in death, you refuse to change. You don't deserve another chance at life. You might as well follow the Eastern Spirit Messenger and accept your fate." Trembling, Miao broke down in tears. "I know I was wrong," he wailed. Jia sighed. "The messenger came earlier, waiting for you to sign the contract. But instead, you went out drinking and never returned. He was too busy to wait any longer. I had no choice but to sign the contract on your behalf, paying him a deposit of 1,000 coins. The rest, 10,000, is due at the end of the month. Once you return to the living, you must gather the amount and burn it in the wilderness at night while calling my name. Only then will the debt be settled." Miao swore to fulfill his promise. Jia hurried him along, leading him to the outskirts of town. Before parting, he issued a final warning. "Do not betray your word, or you will bring disaster upon me." Meanwhile, in the living world, Miao had lain stiff for 3 days. His family, assuming he had drunk himself to death, had all but given up hope. However, a faint breath, like a thread, still lingered in his nostrils. That very day, Miao suddenly jolted awake. He vomited violently, expelling several buckets of putrid black liquid, filling the room with an unbearable stench. He was drenched in sweat, his bedding soaked through. Yet, as the sweat poured out, he felt his body grow lighter. He recounted his otherworldly journey to his family, and soon after, noticed excruciating pain in the places where he had been wounded in the underworld. By the next day, festering sores had formed. Fortunately, they did not worsen, and after 10 days, he could hobble around with a walking stick. His family, fearful of supernatural retribution, urged him to repay his debt to the underworld. However, after calculating the cost, Miao hesitated. Raising the sum would require several taels of silver. He begrudged the expense and dismissed his experience as nothing more than a drunken hallucination. Even if it was real, he scoffed, the Eastern Spirit Messenger let me go in secret. He wouldn't dare report it to the king of the underworld. His family pleaded with him to reconsider, but he refused to listen. Though Miao no longer drank to excess, he remained wary. His neighbors and friends, pleased with his newfound restraint, began to enjoy drinking with him in moderation. For over a year, he upheld his resolve. Yet, as time dulled his memory of the underworld, his old habits crept back. His confidence swelled, and his temper flared once more. One evening, while drinking at a younger clansman's home, he insulted the host. Enraged, the host threw him out and slammed the door shut. Miao ranted and cursed outside for a long time before his son came to fetch him home. The moment he entered his house, Miao collapsed onto his knees, facing the wall. "I'm repaying the debt! I'm repaying the debt!" He wailed, knocking his head against the floor repeatedly. Then he fell still. When his family turned him over, he was already dead. The fifth story of volume 65, titled Martial Arts, is an engaging tale about a man named Li Chao and his martial arts journey. Li Chao, with the courtesy name Qiwu, lived in the far western part of Sichuan County. He was known for his bold, free-spirited nature and his generosity towards monks. One day, a monk came to his house with a begging bowl, seeking alms. Li Chao warmly invited the monk in and treated him to a lavish meal. The monk, grateful for the hospitality, said, "I am a monk from Shaolin Temple, and I possess some martial arts skills. I am willing to teach you." Li Chao was delighted and invited the monk to stay in his guest room, offering him abundant food. For the next 3 months, he trained diligently under the monk's tutelage, learning martial arts day and night. After 3 months, Li Chao had become fairly skilled and couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in his progress. One day, the monk asked him, "Do you feel you've improved?" Li Chao answered confidently, "Yes, master. I've learned all your martial arts techniques." The monk smiled and said, "All right, let's see if you can put them into practice." Li Chao, eager to demonstrate, stripped off his outer clothes and spat into his hands. He began to move, leaping like a monkey and darting through the air like a flying bird. After finishing his demonstration, he stood proudly, waiting for praise. The monk chuckled and said, "Very good. Since you've mastered all my techniques, let's have a friendly match to see how far you've really come." Li Chao eagerly agreed, and they squared off. The two exchanged blows, Li Chao throwing punches and kicks, trying to find an opening in the monk's defense. But then, out of nowhere, the monk leapt into the air and delivered a powerful kick. Before Li Chao could even comprehend what had happened, he was sent flying, crashing to the ground more than 10 feet away. The monk clapped his hands and laughed, saying, "You haven't learned all my martial arts after all." Embarrassed and dejected, Li Chao knelt on the ground, begging for further instruction. The monk, after teaching him a bit more, finally took his leave. From then on, Li Chao became renowned for his martial prowess, traveling across the land and seldom encountering a worthy opponent. One day, while in Jinan on business, Li Chao came across a young Buddhist nun practicing martial arts in a public square. The crowd gathered around her, watching intently. After a while, she called out, "I've been practicing alone here for a while. It's rather dull. If any skilled martial artist is around, please step up and spar with me." She called 3 times, but no one dared to step forward. Watching from the side, Li Chao's hands itched for a challenge. Feeling confident, he decided to take the opportunity. The nun smiled and greeted him with a respectful bow, and the two began to spar. Almost immediately after their first exchange, the nun paused and said, "This is Shaolin-style martial arts." She then asked, "Who is your master?" At first, Li Chao hesitated to reveal the name of his teacher, but after some persistent questioning, he reluctantly admitted, "My master is the monk who taught me." The nun nodded and said, The foolish monk is your teacher? In that case, we don't need to compete any further. I acknowledge my defeat. However, Li Chao insisted on continuing the match, and the nun, though initially reluctant, eventually agreed. She said, "Since we both follow the same path, let's spar, but remember, no harm done. Let's stop when we've had enough." Li Chao, still overconfident and eager to win, agreed. However, despite his youthful energy and desire to prove himself, he underestimated the nun's skill and grace. As they resumed the match, Li Chao, eager to land a blow, leapt forward and kicked towards the nun. But in a swift motion, the nun brought her palm down with such precision, it sliced across Li Chao's leg, sending a sharp, searing pain through his knee. It felt as though his leg had been struck by a blade and he collapsed to the ground, unable to rise. The nun smiled apologetically and said, "I'm terribly sorry. I didn't mean to offend you." Li Chao was carried home, where he spent over a month recovering from his injury. More than a year later, his master visited him, and Li Chao recounted the incident to him. The monk was shocked and exclaimed, "You're such a fool! Why provoke her? Thankfully, you told her my name, otherwise your leg would have been broken for sure." The sixth story in volume 65 is called The Starling. Wang Fenbin once told a story about a man from his hometown who kept a starling. The man had trained the bird to speak, and it became remarkably skilled at it. For several years, the man always took the starling with him when he traveled. One day, while passing through Shaanxi's Jiangzhou, the man found that he had run out of money for his travels. He was in great distress and didn't know what to do. Just then, the starling spoke up and said, "Why don't you sell me? Take me to the Wang family's estate and you'll get a good price. That way, you won't have to worry about the money for your trip." The man hesitated, replying, "How could I bear to sell you?" The starling reassured him, "It's all right. Just get the money, then meet me at the big tree 20 miles west of the city, and I'll catch up with you." Following the starling's advice, the man went to the city, where he and the starling entertained a growing crowd with their dialogue. A eunuch who witnessed this reported it to the prince. Intrigued, the prince summoned the man to his palace, hoping to purchase the bird. The man replied, "I have lived with this bird for so long, I can't bear to part with it." The prince then turned to the starling and asked, "Would you like to stay here?" The starling chirped, "I would like to stay." The prince, impressed, said, "If you like, I'll give you 10 taels of silver." The starling responded, "Don't give me any more than that." The prince, delighted, immediately handed over the silver. The man pretended to be regretful and walked away, as agreed upon. The prince began conversing with the starling, who responded fluently to every question. At one point, the starling demanded meat. After eating, the bird said, "Now I need a bath." The prince ordered his servants to fill a golden basin with water and opened the cage for the bird to wash. Once the starling was done, it flew up to the roof, preened its feathers, and continued chatting with the prince. After a while, with its feathers dry, the bird fluttered off, saying, "I must leave now." The prince, looking around in confusion, realized the bird was gone. He and his servants could only look up at the sky with a deep sigh. They quickly tried to find the man who had sold the bird, but he had already vanished without a trace. Much later, someone traveling to Shaanxi saw the man once again, this time walking around Xi'an with the same starling. This story was recorded by Mr. B. Zaiji. The seventh story in volume 65 is The Three Merchants. There was a scholar from Zhuge City named Shang Xiyu. After drinking heavily one night, he made a joke that offended a wealthy man in the area. The wealthy man, angered, instructed his servants to beat Shang Xiyu, and by the time they carried him home, he had died. Shang Xiyu left behind 2 sons, Shang Chen and Shang Li, and a daughter, Shang Sangguan, who was just 16 years old. Sangguan was supposed to be married soon, but her father's death delayed the wedding. Her 2 brothers attempted to seek justice, but after a year of legal battles, they had no resolution. The family of Sangguan's intended approached her mother, suggesting that they should proceed with a simpler, quicker marriage to avoid further delays. The mother was ready to accept, but When Sangwon heard of it, she went to her mother and said, "How can there be a wedding while my father's body is still unburied? Doesn't he have parents of his own?" Her words made the intended family feel deeply ashamed, and they abandoned their plans. Soon after, the brothers returned home, defeated in court and filled with anger and frustration. They were determined to keep their father's body, hoping it would serve as evidence for further appeals. Sangwon tried to stop them, saying, "Our father is dead, and the authorities won't even take up the case. What kind of world is this? Do you think the heavens will send you a judge just for your sake? How can you bear to leave his body exposed for so long?" Seeing the sense in her words, the brothers reluctantly agreed to bury their father. After the funeral, Sangwon disappeared one night, and no one knew where she had gone. Her mother was anxious and fearful, especially that the in-laws might find out, so she dared not inform the neighbors and relatives. She only asked her sons to discreetly search for her. Months passed, and Sangwon remained missing. One day, the wealthy man who had caused her father's death was celebrating his birthday. He invited some actors to perform, including one named Sun Chun, along with his 2 apprentices. One of them, named Wang Cheng, was ordinary in appearance but had a clear, melodious voice that pleased everyone. The other, named Li Yu, was delicate and handsome, resembling a beautiful woman. When guests asked Li Yu to sing, he hesitated and said he couldn't, but after repeated requests, he performed a song in a local dialect, causing the guests to laugh and applaud. Sun Chun, embarrassed by the poor performance, explained to the host, "This apprentice has only recently started learning and is not yet skilled enough to sing. He usually handles serving wine and such tasks." The host, pleased, asked Li Yu to serve wine. After the banquet, when the guests had left, the host asked Li Yu to stay behind and sleep with him. Li Yu attended to him, preparing the bed and removing his shoes with great attentiveness. The host, intoxicated, made suggestive remarks, but Li Yu only smiled gently. Soon the host dismissed the servants and told Li Yu to stay. As the servants left and went to drink in another room, Li Yu locked the door behind them. After a while, one of the servants heard strange noises coming from the host's room and decided to sneak a peek. To his surprise, it was pitch dark and silent inside. He thought nothing was amiss and turned to leave, but just then, there was a loud crashing sound, as though a heavy object had fallen. The servant rushed back to the door, but there was no answer from inside. He called for help, and soon, they broke down the door to find the host's head separated from his body and Li Yu hanging from a rope. The rope had snapped, causing the body to fall to the floor. The beam and the neck still had traces of the rope. Shocked, the servants quickly moved the body to the yard. When they picked it up, they noticed that the feet were oddly empty, as though there were no feet at all. Upon removing the shoes, they discovered that Li Yu had small feet, and it was then realized that Li Yu was actually a woman. This revelation left everyone astounded. They called for Sun Chun, who was now terrified and unable to speak. He could only say, "Li Yu joined me just a month ago as an apprentice. She volunteered to come for the birthday celebration, but I have no idea where she came from." The body was examined, and as it still felt warm to the touch, the people began to suspect that Li Yu was an assassin sent by the Shang family. They kept the body under guard while they went to the authorities. When the officials arrived, the body was confirmed to be that of Shang Sangguan. The magistrate, intrigued, ordered the brothers Shang Chen and Shang Li to retrieve and bury their sister's body. He also decreed that the wealthy family was not to feud with the Shang family anymore. The 8th story in volume 65 is The Western Monk. 2 monks from the western regions came to China. One was headed to Mount Wutai and the other to Mount Tai. Their clothing, language, and appearance were quite different from those of the Chinese. They shared their experiences with the locals, saying, "We once traveled through the flaming mountain, where the peaks overlapped and the smoke rose like steam. The heat was unbearable, like being in an oven. To pass this mountain, one must wait for the rain to stop. When you walk, you must be cautious, focusing your gaze on the ground and taking small, slow steps. If you accidentally step on a rock, flames will suddenly burst out and burn you. They also described their journey through the Shifting Sands River, where there was a crystal mountain. The cliffs were so steep they seemed to pierce the sky. The mountain itself was translucent, some its peaks as clear as glass. The monks also spoke of a narrow pass that could only fit one cart at a time, guarded by 2 dragons who crossed their jaws. Travelers were required to bow to the dragons, and if the dragons allowed passage, their jaws would open on their own. The dragons were white, and their scales shimmered like crystal. The monks continued. We traveled for 18 years in total. When we left the West, there were 12 of us, but by the time we arrived in China, only the 2 of us remained. In the West, people say there are 4 famous mountains in China: Mount Tai, Mount Hua, Mount Wutai, and Mount Luojia. These mountains are said to be full of gold, and the bodhisattvas, Guanyin, and Manjushri live on these mountains. Anyone who can visit them is destined to become a Buddha and live forever. The way the Western monks spoke sounded quite similar to how people in our land admire the Western paradise. If someone traveling to the West were to meet someone traveling to the East along the way, and they shared their respective experiences, they would probably end up laughing at each other. They would realize that their long journeys were all in vain, as the realities of both regions are far different from their lofty expectations. This story reflects the idea of people idealizing distant lands and their pursuits for wisdom or immortality, only to discover that the journey itself often falls short of the dreams they set out with. The 9th story in volume 65 is The Mud Ghost. In my hometown, there was a scholar named Tang Jiwu who, when he was a child, went to a temple with a cousin to play. Tang Jiwu was very brave as a child. While wandering around, he saw a mud ghost in the corridor. The ghost had angry eyes and its glass-like eyeballs shone brightly. Tang Jiwu was fascinated and secretly dug out one of the glass eyes, hiding it in his clothes as he went home. Upon returning home, Tang Jiwu's cousin suddenly fell ill and became mute. After a while, the cousin suddenly stood up and shouted in a harsh voice, "Why did you dig out my eyes?" He kept yelling, and no one knew what was happening. Tang Jiwu then confessed to his family what he had done. Upon hearing this, the family quickly began praying and said, "The child is young and didn't understand. He has hurt your noble eyes, and we will return them immediately." As soon as they spoke these words, the cousin loudly declared, "In that case, I must leave." With that, he collapsed and fell unconscious. It took a long time before he slowly regained his senses. When asked what he had just said, he was completely unaware. The family immediately took the glass eye back to the temple and placed it back into the mud ghost's eye socket. The historian Yishi said, "When asking for the eyes, why was the mud ghost so extraordinary? Why did it take its anger out on Tang Jiwu's cousin, who was just traveling with him? This was because Tang Jiwu, being a prominent scholar, was known for his integrity. His reputation, especially after resigning from his official post to live in seclusion after writing about politics, was so formidable that even the gods were wary of him, so it was no surprise that a mud ghost would react in such a way. This story touches on the supernatural, suggesting that the divine or spiritual realm might hold grudges against those who offend them, even if the act was done unknowingly. It also highlights the power of a person's integrity and the respect it demands, even from the supernatural. The 10th story in volume 65 is Farewell in a Dream. Mr. Li Wangchun's grandfather was very close to my late uncle, Yu Tiangong. One night, Li's grandfather had a dream where he saw Yu Tiangong come to his house. Yu Tiangong appeared sorrowful and spoke to him. Li's grandfather asked, "What brings you here?" Yu Tiangong replied, "I'm leaving for a distant journey, and I came to say goodbye." Li's grandfather asked, "Where are you going?" Yu Tiangong answered, "It's very far." After speaking, he turned and began to walk away. Li's grandfather followed him to a valley where he saw a crack in the stone wall. Yu Tiangong bowed and said farewell, then slowly retreated backward into the crack, disappearing without a sound when Li called after him. Suddenly, Li's grandfather woke up from the dream and, as the morning light broke, he told his family about the dream and asked them to prepare for a funeral, saying, "Yu Tiangong has passed away." His father-in-law, Jingyi, advised him to send someone to check and confirm before making any funeral arrangements, but Li's grandfather wouldn't listen. He immediately put on mourning clothes and went to Yu Tiangong's house. Upon arriving, he found a white funeral flag already hanging on the door. Alas, the ancients believed so deeply in their friendships, even to the point of trusting in the afterlife. There is a story of Zhang Yuanbo's funeral carriage waiting for Fan Zhuqing to arrive before it could proceed, which surely is no absurd tale. This story reflects on the deep emotional connections and unwavering trust that existed between close friends in ancient times. It also speaks to the belief in spiritual connections and the idea that the bonds of friendship might transcend even death. The 11th story in Volume 65 is Immortal Su. When Gao Mingtutu was the governor of Quanzhou, an intriguing event occurred. A woman named Su, a commoner, was washing clothes by the river. There was a large stone in the river, and she sat on it. On the stone was a soft green moss, smooth and charming, gently swaying with the water, making circles around the stone. The woman looked at it, and something stirred within her. When she returned home, she found herself pregnant, and her belly began to grow day by day. Her mother, noticing this, quietly asked her what had happened. The woman confessed the truth, but her mother couldn't understand it at first. Months later, the woman gave birth to a boy. The family thought of abandoning him, but the woman couldn't bear it, so she hid him in a cabinet and raised him secretly. She also decided not to marry, to show her resolve that a good woman never marries twice. However, having a child without a husband was still shameful. The boy grew up to be 7 years old, and he had never met anyone outside the family. One day, the boy suddenly said to his mother, "I'm growing up now, and I can't stay hidden forever. I must leave and not burden you for life." The mother asked him where he would go. The boy replied, "I'm not of human origin. I need to soar into the sky." The mother tearfully asked when he would return, to which he replied, "I'll come back when you pass away. After I leave, if you ever need anything, just open the cabinet where I'm hidden. Whatever you want will be there." After saying this, he bid his mother farewell and walked away. When the mother went outside, he had already disappeared without a trace. The woman told her elderly mother about it, and the old woman found it very strange. From then on, the woman remained steadfast in her decision not to marry and lived with her mother. However, their living conditions became increasingly difficult. Sometimes they had no food. One day, the woman remembered what her son had said and opened the cabinet. To her surprise, she found rice and flour inside, so she cooked a meal for her mother. Whenever they lacked something, it would appear in the cabinet, fulfilling their needs. 3 years later, the woman's mother died of illness, and all the funeral supplies were taken from the cabinet. After burying her mother, the woman lived alone for 30 more years, never once approaching a man. One day, a neighbor woman came to borrow fire from the woman's house. After a brief conversation, she left. A little while later, a colorful cloud appeared around the woman's house, clearly visible as a lid. In the cloud stood a person dressed in magnificent clothes. Upon closer inspection, it was the woman from the Su family. The cloud spun around for a long time before rising higher and eventually disappearing from view. The neighbors, curious, went into her house and found that she had dressed beautifully and was sitting upright, but no longer breathing. Everyone, seeing her loneliness, began to discuss how to arrange her funeral. Suddenly, a young man entered the house. He was tall and handsome and thanked each person individually. The neighbors, having heard of the woman's son, didn't question him. The young man took out money to cover the burial expenses and planted 2 peach trees beside the grave before leaving. As he walked away, clouds appeared beneath his feet, and soon he vanished. The peaches from the 2 trees grew sweet and delicious. The locals began to call them Su Immortal Peaches, and each year the trees flourished with abundant fruit. Officials would often take these peaches as gifts for their friends. This story reflects themes of mystical occurrences, filial piety, and the transformative power of love and dedication. The legend of the immortal Su not only speaks of the extraordinary nature of the Su family's child, but also immortalizes their legacy through the magical peaches that continue to thrive year after year. The 12th story in volume 65 and the last story in this volume is titled The Solitary Taoist. The Solitary Taoist is about a young man named Mr. Han from a prestigious family in Sichuan County. One day, a Taoist named Shan, who was skilled in magic tricks, caught Han's interest. Mr. Han admired the Taoist's abilities and treated him as an honored guest. Shan often surprised people by disappearing suddenly when walking or sitting with others. Intrigued by this skill, Mr. Han asked the Taoist to teach him the art of invisibility. Shan, however, refused. He explained, "It's not that I'm unwilling to teach you, but I fear it might damage my reputation. If I were to teach a nobleman like you, it might be fine, but if a dishonest person learned it, they could use it to commit crimes. You, of course, would never misuse it. But imagine, if you were to fall in love with a beautiful young woman and use this technique to sneak into her chamber, wouldn't I then be an accomplice in your wrongdoing?" Mr. Han, frustrated, couldn't force Shan to teach him, but he secretly harbored resentment. He conspired with his servants to punish the Taoist. Fearing Shan might use his invisibility trick to escape, they sprinkled fine ash on the ground in a grain field, believing that if the Taoist used his invisibility, his footsteps would leave traces in the ash, allowing them to track him down. Once everything was prepared, Mr. Han lured the Taoist to the field and ordered his servants to beat him with whips. As expected, Shan disappeared, but the footprints in the ash proved he had walked through the area. The servants began to strike wildly in all directions, and soon the ash was flying, but Shan was nowhere to be found. Frustrated, Mr. Han returned home, thinking the matter was over. However, not long after, Shan returned. He greeted the servants who had been with him and said, "I can no longer stay here. You've been kind to me, but it's time for me to leave and repay your hospitality." From his sleeve, Shan pulled out a jar of fine wine and a plate of delicious food, setting them on the table. He continued to pull out more and more food and drink until the table was piled high. Shan then invited everyone to sit and drink. The servants were overjoyed, enjoying the lavish feast. After the meal, Shan calmly returned the wine jar and plates back into his sleeve, as if nothing unusual had happened. Intrigued by the Taoist's strange actions, Mr. Han asked him to perform another trick. Shan then drew a city on the wall, and to everyone's amazement, when he touched the city's gates, they opened. Shan threw his belongings into the city through the gates, turned to Mr. Han, and said, "Goodbye." With that, he leaped into the city, and the gates closed behind him. Shan vanished without a trace. Later, Mr. Han heard that someone had spotted Shan again, this time in the market of Qingzhou. There, he was seen teaching children how to draw ink circles on their palms. When he flicked his hand, the ink circles would fall onto people's faces or clothes. It was also said that Shan was skilled in the art of seduction, able to make a man perform intimate acts after drinking a pot of strong wine, an ability that Mr. Han had once personally witnessed. The story of the solitary Taoist blends mystery, magic, and wit. The Taoist's ability to disappear and perform remarkable feats leaves a deep impression, but it is also a cautionary tale about trust, envy, and the misuse of power. Shan's tricks are both amusing and thought-provoking, with the tale ultimately highlighting the unpredictable nature of those who hold such mystical skills. Thank you so much for joining us. Together, we've explored Volume 65 of the Complete Illustrated Tales of Liaozhai. Originally, the Complete Illustrated Tales of Liaozhai consisted of 90 volumes, and currently, 23 volumes are known to exist. Apart from the 17 volumes housed in the Austrian National Library, Volume 28 is held at the Martin Bodmer Foundation Library in Geneva, Switzerland. Volumes 24, 39, and 67 were sold for $75,000 at a Sotheby's auction in New York in September 2018, with signed labels on the inserts of volumes 24 and 39 reading Yuanmu Dei Jai Collection. Volume 55 was sold in June 2019 at an auction by Nagel Auction House in Germany. Additionally, one unknown volume was sold by Bonhams in New York for $20,000 in March 2013. Researchers have confirmed that the complete illustrated Tales of Liao Zhai is the earliest known illustration of the Liao Zhai tales, bridging the gap between manuscript versions and the publication of the annotated illustrated Tales of Liao Zhai more than 100 years later. The images we've shared are part of publicly available collections. Regardless, thank you again for tuning in to Eastern Brush, Western Soul, a channel dedicated to the love of ancient Eastern texts and paintings. We appreciate your company, and we look forward to more explorations together.